Briefly introduce Françoise. So Françoise Vergès is a political theorist and a feminist activist. Since 2018, she has been the president of the association Decolonizing the Art in France, and previously she was the chairholder of the Global South Europe chair at the Fondation Maison de Sciences de l'Homme in Paris from 2014 to 2018. And previously the president of the French Committee for the Remembrance and the History of Slavery from 2009 to 2012. She has written, researched, and curated exhibits and produced documentaries on several topics and matters, the history of slavery and abolitionism, on colonialism, and in particular on French colonialism, on colonial and post-colonial psychiatry in the French Empire, on post-colonial museography, on anti-colonialism, and especially on French anti-colonial thinkers such as Françoise Vergès and Aimé Césaire, and of course on feminism. Among her publications, I will just mention Monsters and Revolutionaries, Colonial Family Romance, that came out with Duke University Press in 1999, and another book who's coming, translated again by Duke, Women and Their Wounds, Capitalism, Racialization, and Feminism. And her very last book is this one, Féminisme décolonial, Decolonial Feminism, and this is the topic of lecture of Françoise today. Let me just tell you that this book was quite of an intellectual event in France, since it came out in February, and for better or for worse, in the sense that she received a lot of attention, the book received a lot of attention, and she deserved also a lot of compliments for this book. And I will just quote the words of a columnist, the French columnist Marcella Yacoub, who wrote in the French newspaper Libération that with her book, with this book, Françoise Vergès is attempting to abolish feminism as a political category for emancipation, to turn it into an oppressive ideology that needs to be fought against, like pesticides. So let's see if, what Françoise is doing to feminism. For the moment, then we'll have time for Q&A.
Well, good evening. Do you? It's okay there? You hear me in the back? Yeah? Good? Okay. Okay, so yes, it's going to be about this book, and as Jamila said, it has triggered a lot of interest among young women in France, racialized, as we say, and but also some attacks. But we can talk about the attacks, but they are banal. It's nothing. Not very interesting. They are not the kind of critique that trigger thought. Just blah 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 blah. So it's usually there's not much to say. But we can talk about it. Nonetheless we can talk about it. What it means. What is the content of this attack? So anyway, why this book? After the book that's going to come out also in English, which was about the woman's womb and the question of race, capitalism, and feminism, and the way in which the woman's womb, not the woman's womb in the way that European feminism has looked at, but if we look at the racialization of the woman's womb, the fact that the wombs of the black woman was capitalized, was transformed into a capital, through slavery, and the children they could have were also capital. So it was about that, and tracing how, in fact, as soon as the state started to look at the birth, at the birth rate, and trying to control that, there was one politics for white and politics for non-white women right away. And it was interesting for me to look at how it, how colonial slavery, the different powers, manage to control this. And first, so I look at the way, the fact that African women had given birth to millions of Africans that had been taken and captured. And it's very rare that the women are being talked about. The fact that they produced, the women in Africa who stayed in Africa had babies, who became, thinking and speaking human beings, so because you did not capture 2-year-old babies, and before they were captured and taken into slavery. And that worked, so they contributed. That was a reproduction that was become totally invisible in the history of the woman's womb, and that it was exploited So Africa was not exploited only as a continent and the workforce being taken, but the women's womb, the African women were exploited because their womb was effectively exported. And then I was looking at how it happened in the different colonies, and the fact that, you know, in the United States, since the slave trade with Africa was abolished in 1808, there was a reproduction, local reproduction, what they call slave breeding industry, local, you know, in the United States itself. So, which did not mean that you had barracks where women were, you know, producing, but effectively some state like the state of Virginia or other state became known for effectively have a market for new slaves, you know, and women were, enslaved women were giving birth and being raped 6-8 weeks after giving birth, so they could become, you know, pregnant again. And in the archive you find women who are 20-year-old and having given birth already to 8 to 10 children. So that was a United States solution, if we can say, you know, of reproduction of that workforce. But in the British and French colony, it was not that. They did not want, in fact, you had discussion between the slave owners and saying, we don't want to, because a baby, you cannot send her, or, you know, you cannot send her or him to the field. And so we're going to lose time, you know, and in fact, even if we bring, if we force the woman, the pregnant woman to work, she won't be able to work really until the end, right? So we're going to lose like some weeks at the end of a pregnancy, and then we're going to lose that person who is born because we cannot send him to the field. So they chose the question of importation. So this is why you have so much, you know, being, that the importation. So I was looking at the exploitation of the, you know, black woman's womb, how it was managed differently. And it led me to ask, you know, why the women's movement in France was so, and even in Europe, was so indifferent to that history, and transforming the right to abortion and contraception as a universal right, as if, you know, all women were alike, and not paying attention that their state had two different politics at the same time. So in the 70s, when women in France were absolutely marching the street in Southern, asking for, you know, access to abortion and contraception, the same state was forcing women to abort and be sterilized without consent and without even them knowing. They were sent to a clinic where they were told they had to have some kind of surgery and to have, like, you know, anesthesia, and they were, you know, waking up in the morning, being aborted and sterilized. Some of them were pregnant 3, 4, 5 months old, you know. And the doctors who performed that were white doctors from France. And there was a trial because nonetheless it became a scandal in the 1970s in June. And the last trial happened in February 1971, and none of the doctor was punished. None. You know, they were out free. And that was, you know, at the moment, and this story was told in all the French national newspaper, and the women's liberation movement did not never react to that when they marched. So that was also this tension for me. The fact that the women's movement, why the women's movement had remained indifferent to that dual policy, that not integrating them in their thinking about abortion. And there was also a discussion, debate at the time that why is the law, you know, why are we asking for a law that's going to give power to doctors and hospitals? Because it, you know, it will be doctors who will perform the abortion rather than free clinic, free women clinic, free feminist clinics. So there was also a discussion of, you know, how the law had become very quickly the most important, you know, tool in the end of feminism, you know, the most important, the hegemonic one. So all these questions remained to me, you know, in my head when I finished that book, and I wanted to know more about the question of feminism. Why has been, you know, so indifferent to imperialism, you know, of the 70s and 80s. So, so, you know, to explore the blind spot of European feminism. And then the fact that starting, let's say, in the 2010, everyone could be, you know, say that I am a feminist, you know, like corporate, far right, everyone was a feminist, you know, could be a feminist, and you even had the book, We Are All Feminists, you know. The army was the most feminist, you know, things in the world, and all this, you know, so that was like, why feminism, which had been an insult like related to being lesbian and not shaving your legs and not liking men, had become something that like could be claimed by so many women. And then the movement in the global south for the last, let's say, 6 years, the huge demonstration in Argentina, in India, in Mexico, in Morocco, all these places, what kind of feminism was being deployed and how it was connected to the feminism in the south of the 70s, which had been buried a little by the feminism of the north between the 70s and 80s. So that was this question. So my question was more like in the public space, right? Not what happened in academia, where you have the most, like interesting analysis of feminism and queer feminism and indigenous feminism, but what's happening in the ground, what also affects the policies. And so I started to say, okay, we have to take back feminism. I have just to say something, I don't like to talk about myself so much. For a long time, I will never have called myself a feminist, never. People say, you're a feminist? I say, no, never. I am for the women, for the liberation of women. What I like when I arrived in France in the late 70s was movement, liberation, women. I like that because, of course, it echoes liberation, movement of national liberation, decolonization, and so on. So okay, of course. And so the question of liberation, right? And I could not also forget the origin of European feminism in the 18th century. That time was, that they had more time. They had more time for the bourgeoisie. They had more time to think about freedom, about rights, because so many women were enslaved and exploited, and making Europe much more wealthy, with sugar and coffee. So I could not forget, and also the origin of rights. I mean, all the liberal philosophy that led to reforms, very important reform, but the way in which nonetheless, the way in which how racism and colonialism had affected European feminism. And I never saw that question, that, like self-analysis. Not just, oh, this is racism, whatever, but what kind of feminism has emerged from that. So that was, so I went to some archive, feminist archive in Paris, to look at the role of feminists, how it moved also from liberation of women to women's right. How there was practically no more, talk about liberation, but women's right, and moving. And that will become rights, gay rights, lesbian rights, queer rights, rights, rights. And how we have moved toward that. So I wanted to revisit that history and to understand what happened between the 70s and the 80s. Because even though the women's liberation movement in Europe did not reflect on the way in which racism and colonialism may have affected their theory and practice, it was not that there were, a lot of very radical, very political groups, right? In Italy, in Germany, in France, and elsewhere. So and in Spain. So what had happened? Why? Even though they were anti-capitalist, anti-patriarchy, and anti-imperialism, it was usually U.S. imperialism, right? So racism over there, not what was happening here, nothing about French imperialism, German imperialism, or Italian. So it was always something over there. And if they were talking about racism, it was about the migrant workers, the victims, but not. And it's as if the feminism had been the only ideology in Europe which has been protected from being affected by racism and colonialism. As by the 70s, 80s, you had critique about, communism, socialism, different leftist ideology, showing how they had been blind to racism and colonialism, they had not understood really deeply what it meant. And it has if feminism had, was totally innocent. So I was also interested in that innocence, how it was innocent, even from the left, in the leftists. So this was, the context. So, to give also, what happened in the 70s and 80s that I think really for me are very important. I will say that I saw two different, very important movements to which, feminists in Europe will contribute. Anti-revolutionary movement, in the mid-1970s, with people like the new philosopher in France, or André Glucksmann, who has his book in 1975, and also Françoise Vergès, an historian who was very, very important to criticize the French Revolution, and saying, French Revolution had led to terror, Bolshevik Revolution had led to Gulag, Spanish Revolution had led to, inter-fight, and so all revolutions were bad. We could understand perhaps the desire for them, but in fact they all led to catastrophe. And this was very, very important. Even in March 1977, in an interview in a French newspaper, Michel Foucault answered to Bernard-Henri Lévy, and he said the return of revolution as a notion, this is the problem, Foucault said. It is the very desire of revolution that is the problem. That desiring revolution was the problem. We had to get rid of that idea. We have to give up the question of revolution. By in 1985, the CIA had issued a report and saying they did the work we could not have done. We are very thankful because they really turned the French opinion and the European opinion, against what happened. So revolution is bad, that it's really naive, it's just naive people, young people, 20-year-olds, they don't know better. The second also movement that was quite important in that time, which I see, is anti-colonialism, right? Anti-colonialism has been really the matrix of all different, transforming the world, but also the thought. And it was very important, and it was important because both movements came from the left, from people identified with the left. Whether anti-revolution, even though considering André Glucksmann and Françoise Vergès, but nonetheless they were identified. It did not come from the right or the extreme right. It will not have worked. The fact that it came from the left helped a lot. So anti-colonialism was also very important because such a big generation in Europe has been, absolutely politicized by anti-colonialism, by contributing to the struggle, of a different generation or supporting. In 1983, you had a book which was translated right away, mostly in most languages in the world, was The Tears of the White Man by Pascal Bruckner, in which, he said, he mocked the sentimentalism of the left and, the pious form of compassion. He wrote that Europeans have been raised in self-hating, convinced that at the heart of our culture, something demanded repentance. The evil has two names, colonialism and imperialism, he said. And so this kind of a third worldism, as he said, has constructed, and I quote, a glorious south populated with lambs and martyrs, opposed to the avaricious north inhabited by wolves and wealthy people. So that was, the reversion of being dominating, that those who are dominated were the victim now. And that became really a very important rhetorical device in that way. So that was lauded. The book was already, and he wrote also, solidarity with oppressed people is above all a gigantic weapon aimed at the West. So we had already, decided that these are the threats. Besides the threat of revolution, you have the threat of anti-colonialism, because it makes you think of the world as, and in fact these people who are supposedly oppressed are in fact the people who would, aim at the North, or the worst enemy of the North and of liberal democracy. So communism, third worldism, and so on were the real enemy of democracy in Europe. And remember that in 1979 you had the Iranian Revolution, which was also something that totally disturbed them, it was not part of this. So all this began slowly to build an atmosphere of European superiority because, of the new civilizing mission, because Europeans had invented liberal democracy and rights. So to continue with the context, in which I will go back to feminism, let's not forget also huge social and economic change at the time. In the 70s, women entered massively, as we call the job market, everywhere, north and south. Massively, women entered, like the service and industry and also. But you have also, like industry closing in the north and the global south. What kind of, like this will be cotton, here you will have tissue, beans. So, and more poverty. The beginning by the late 70s of structural adjustment programs that will bring an incredible poverty around the south. And the 1980s, so by the time of the 1980s around, you have neoliberalism. Less state, more privatization, and the service industry. Right? So racialized women will be domestic workers, sex workers, or will enter the factories, like to have t-shirt and everything for the West. And the racialized men will have been construction job, in agriculture, they remember, all the union, in California, people from Mexico and everywhere, but also here in Spain, from Morocco, and also in sex work. So this was happening in a moment, as I said, of privatization of, health services, education, and jobs being, like closed practically in the South. So that was very, very, very important of that, because neoliberalism was an attack in a way on liberalism, on liberalism as reform. And it was really, you are your own capital, and you have to have your capital, you are your own capital. And you have to have this capital, you make it good. It's up to you, and if you cannot do that, it's really bad. So, Thatcher, remember, there is no alternative to capitalism, and also there is no society, only individuals. Reagan was elected in the 1980s, so there was this moment. What I mean is like, it's a context, this kind of context, because you cannot look at feminism just by looking at what men were doing, so feminism, it's also part of this incredible transformation, ideological, social and economic transformation. So the feminists were there, by the 80s, feminists, the feminists of the 70s have lost some of their power, because liberalism had integrated some of them. They were Ministry of the Right of Women. In France, there were, consideration about, for helping some feminist department to open here and there. Gender was something that everyone was talking about. World Bank and IMF, where, you had to have the chapter on gender everywhere, otherwise you will not get, money or whatever, so gender had become also the hegemonic notion. And some things. Remember also there was a decade of the of women by the United Nations that started in Mexico, and then Copenhagen, and then in Nairobi. Nairobi was a big thing, because a lot of women had come from Africa. Of course, it was on the African continent, but also from Asia. And the first time also they met with Palestinian women. So the question of Palestine was very strong in Nairobi. Angela Davis was there. So suddenly, the decade was escaping, the end of the power, because it was, it was in fact a project of pacification of struggle, to turn effectively to rights, only rights, just rights. So it should have ended in Nairobi, but they had a new meeting in Beijing. And in Beijing, the last speech was by Hillary Clinton, who closed the decade with a speech about that women's rights are human rights. And here we were, right? No longer effectively women's rights will become, in fact, the politics of government and an international institution. So you had this institution, and even the government of the United States at the beginning did not want to support the decade. They did not want, and then under Carter, they started to say, this has to become the US policy in foreign affairs. Women's rights have to lead what we are doing elsewhere in the world. Really, so if you read the report. So I was, so this was interesting. In Europe, in France itself, because France was this place of French theory and French feminism, so everyone was looking at what was happening, between Foucault, Deleuze, Guattari, Lucie Irigaray, and others. So it was really, very, very big. But so by 1980s, as I say, there was some kind of institutionalization in France. The feminist movement had lost its power. So what happened in 1989, that I look at it as a really very important moment. First, at the beginning of 1989, you have the fatwa by Khomeini against Salman Rushdie. And I don't want to enter in the question of,
but it totally triggers an incredible Orientalist campaign in Europe, right? Muslims don't understand fiction. They don't get it, they take it literally. So you had the beginning, it was already there by the 80s, but in 1989. There was also a different thing, but what interests me mostly, it was the bicentennial of the French Revolution that year. So on the 14th of July, there was a big, of course, march, but it was in the presence of the G7, the leaders of the 7 most wealthiest countries in the world. Now it's G20. By then it was only 7 countries. So you had Thatcher, you had Reagan, you had Pinochet. They were all looking at the march. And this was a spectacle on July 14, which was very important, called the Global Tribe. That was the name of that spectacle. And the modern tribe was different tribe, the planetary global tribe. And that planetary tribe was constituted of different tribes that the public could identify right away. So black people were marching half naked and beating on drums. So people say, oh, Africa. Okay. And then other men, were marching and under some artificial snow. So people say, oh, Russian. Okay. And then after people were marching under the rain, artificial rain with umbrella, oh, that's the British marching, right? So all these different tribes, were identified through whatever, and they arrive on the Place de la Concorde, which means effectively all together. And there was like the image of globalization, happy and harmonious globalization, really. And the G7, the resolution of the leaders were absolutely okay to turn towards neoliberalism. That was on the one hand. On the same day, at another place in Paris, there was the meeting of the 7 poorest countries of the world, representative of the 7 poorest countries of the world. And they met, and it's a long story that started in the 70s, when even in the 50s with the Bandung meeting in 1955, and following by different things of the tricontinental, the question of the South, right? And the question of erasing the debt of the South. That was a big thing, you had to erase the debt, that the North should erase that debt. And in 1976, they had a meeting in Alger, and a manifesto was, the declaration of the right of peoples. So not of men and citizens, but of people as political actors. And one of the principles of that declaration of right of people was the right to existence, which has existed since the insurrection and revolt of slaves and colonized. That the fact that their existence had been denied by racism, right, by this division that happened in the 16th century. And so existence was not meant, I exist, but the question of existence in a world in which their humanity had been denied. That was very important. So they wrote a manifesto in 1899 that they sent to the other guys who never even read it. So it was for me, really what happened, that the third world was disappearing from the discussion. No longer. There was, before there was all the debt of the third world, what do we do, development, whatever. By then it was like, okay, this is the road to happiness, is, globalization and neoliberalism. And then later in 1899 was the fall of the Berlin Wall, so that was like the end of the story, right? So my hypothesis is like some women saw the way in which that this story will not end, because they will offer a new mission to the West. And how I see that? In September of 1899, two girls, because they were 14-year-old, 15-year-old, arrived in their high school with a veil. What is called the veil in France, but it's just close. They call it the veil. And so there was like, so the director of the high school, told them to go back home, and there was some agitation, but not much. So at the end of, in October, the family planning, how do you call that, the family planning? The planning familial, how do you say in English? Control,
Family planning?
Yeah, but the big one, that is everywhere. Anyway.
It's not family planning? Doesn't make sense.
Yes, exactly. Planned Parenthood, the French Planned Parenthood issued a text by saying something has happened in September that is very, very, very worrying, and we have really to mobilize. The veil is coming and so on, and it's threatening the rights. Okay, the letter, what happened? So you have all, elements, submission, patriarchy, the worst patriarchy in the world, the question of brothers and fathers. There was no mother in the story. And the fact that this girl were effectively, and that the Republic had to save them. Because the Republic is by nature the place for the liberation of women. And so slowly, and so 3 days later, because they thought that again this open letter published in every newspaper had not been, had not made enough, impact. There was a big meeting organized in a big place that was usually, it's called Mutualité, when usually you had anti-imperialist, feminist, queer meetings, and now it was a meeting. It was called For Laïcité and for Women's Rights. And it was called by women who had, done a lot in supporting the Algerian nationalism and being really associated with the left. And that was very important. That they had been, that they could be identified as and belong to the movement supporting the Algerian independence and being from the left. One of them was Gisèle Halimi, who was a very important lawyer, feminist lawyer, who had defended Algerian women who had been tortured by the paratrooper, French paratrooper, who had been also lawyers in a very famous case of abortion, in which a young woman who had been raped was, accused of having aborted and with her mother, because abortion was a crime in France still, and also another trial, one of the first big trial about rape. So she was very well known. She had a review, she was incredibly well known. She was on TV constantly, and she was really the leader of that movement. So it was very important because I read everything that was published then. And it was really how the French feminists, some French feminists from the left, offered the whole, vocabulary, all the elements of the Islamophobic vocabulary. Really. And then, so they felt again that it was not making an impact enough, and so all the end of '89 and also the beginning of 1990, they are sending letters to ministers, to leaders of, civil rights association, of human rights association, to, different people, saying, please pay attention. Something is happening. Something is threatening women's rights, and it's Islam. That was in '89, right? And what we hear today, all through Europe, are absolutely, really the word we could, that we have written in '89. And it worked so well that by, like 6 months later, there was the first debate at the French National Assembly about the veil, to forbid the veil in school and other public spaces. And you had already the alliance from the left to the right about it. Like there was a minister from, it was a left government, socialist government, and there was a minister of women's rights. And so she started to say, yes, I agree, we have to do something about the veil. And someone from the conservative, oh, my dear friend, of course you are so right, oh, my dear friend. And, like friend, around effectively on women's, Muslim women. So it was really the beginning of that alliance from the left, and even sometime from the left, some leftists, to the far right, around that women's rights will become the new civilizing mission. So the West, which was criticized already for its politics of development, that had failed, that people were criticizing, in Africa or elsewhere, the Green Revolution in Asia was also very criticized. Women's rights offered absolutely the best card in the game. Who is against women's rights? Who can be against women's rights, right? Nobody is for, young girl of 12-year-old being married, for, force or, female mutilation, genital mutilation, or whatever. So it's very strong, very strong. They offered really the MasterCard to imperialism and neoliberalism. Women's rights is, it's a very difficult discourse to oppose, So really it saved the West, from that, it offers a new civilizing mission, and this is why I call it civilizing feminism, rather than white and bourgeois, because I think it had gone further, further, and it's a civilizing mission that can work even in the South, or in the East and South and so on, because it's a question of women's rights. It's a civilizing feminism because it borrowed from the civilizing mission, colonial civilizing mission, this idea that in Europe is a natural soil of rights, right? So but in a spirit of generosity and openness, we bring it to these people over there. So it was really proposed, not really as, marching on, but are really, and a lot of testimony were published in different languages at the time, mostly around Muslim society, with the story of oppressed women, right? I mean, the famous Never Without My Daughter, I don't know if you know that, it was like sold in everywhere, and it's an American woman who married an Iranian. The Iranian take her back to Iran. At the beginning, she's very happy, and of course, he beats her, rapes her, whatever, and so on and so forth. So she wants to escape. The escape would be incredible through the snowy mountain of Kurdistan and so on and so forth, with a lion and everything, and like horrible Muslim men, and she will arrive in Turkey. And that was, that was all, there was a movie afterwards, and this is, by the late 80s movies, and so on. It was an incredible, it used all the tools, TV, cinema, books, fiction, testimonies, everything, it was not just, it was really, really understood that you had to go through. And the question of really, and even so to the extent that after the attack on the Twin Towers, the wife of Bush Jr. went to the United Nations and had a speech in which she said, we did not know where Afghanistan was, right? And so we discovered Afghanistan after the attack, right? We discovered there was a country called Afghanistan. And we discovered that the women were absolutely terribly oppressed there. We could not stand that. We had to do something. We had to intervene. We had to go and intervene. So it was really framed very clearly in terms of women's rights. And it may look like, okay, well, yeah, but this just these people. No, really, it became gender became absolutely, necessary to get money subvention. Really. I remember 2 years ago, when I was in northeast of India, in Assam and Nagaland, which had been occupied by the Indian army for a long time. So torture, rape, corruption, everything. So there are small tribes living there, And the women came, we had a workshop on question of feminism. And they were women who really worked for their community with so little. It was incredible. But when they were describing what they were doing, they were speaking in NGO vocabulary. Capacity building, women's empowerment. I felt like, someone was making them speak, They were perfect. So I could not tell them, okay, this is crap, because, okay, who am I? I'm not just living by. So I thought about it, I thought about, how to explain that they were trapped. And so I tried to explain, I said, okay, you're doing that, you are repairing what has been broken, constantly. So endless work, as any woman's work. Cleaning, right? Cleaning isn't, is never done. Could we spend a little time that who has broken that? Because it does not arrive broken. Someone has broken this, someone has produced that situation. Okay, so I say, can you tell me why in your village this is happening? And they started to talk, and very quickly they felt free to speak without NGO vocabulary. But they felt that they had to talk through that vocabulary because they think this is the way they're going to be listened to also. So the imperialism of NGO vocabulary is huge, and it's a vocabulary of women's rights. It's really good. So that for me, the question also, the fact that gender, for me, I say that in the book, like, should we still go with gender as a notion? Is not gender another colonial notion? There is also, of course, the argument of Maria Lugones and others saying that, yes, gender is a colonial notion. That European power arrived with an idea of gender, and the fact that it was binary gender, women and men, absolutely ignoring everywhere, all the form of gendering or sexuality, of sexual identification, and imposing even on the body, the way you dress, the way you become a man, the way you become a woman, right? Bringing also the criminalization of homosexuality in most places. So what should we do with gender? In the way, so we could still use it because it's what are the word, right? And I don't have a huge imagination for the word, so I'm using it, but I'm trying to be really aware of that coloniality, the coloniality of that notion. Even the notion of woman, the category of woman, it's impressed as a category that is associated with sexual difference, right? And therefore, as if, okay, it's natural, but okay, so Simone de Beauvoir said, one is not born a woman, was become a woman, but not even my question. It's the way in which women are produced by capitalism and patriarchy. So my book starts with a strike of a woman who do cleaning in the railway station. And because there was a strike in one of the railways in Paris, and they won after 45 years. These are women, all black, brown women, right? All women of color, in their 40s, 50s, because women in the cleaning industry are in their 40s, 50s, not very young. Not the 20s, 30s. And it's totally invisible. And I became interested in that because it's invisible and totally necessary. The world will not function. And I'm not talking domestic work at home. I'm talking about all the offices, which are the first client of the cleaning industry, the theater, the hospital. Everywhere we have to go to. Every morning you drop your kids at the school is clean, and this has to be, so it has to be done very early in the morning or very late at night. It has to be invisible, but it's totally necessary. And I was also interested because when the strike ended, and there have been a lot of strike around domestic work in the United States, in Mexico, in India, and in Europe, and I think it's very important what's happening. And I will stay away. But I want to go back, why I started with that, because I started with that strike and saying that it brings together, and this is why for decolonial feminism is important, it brings together migration, the question of migration, legal or illegal, as they say, the sexualization of work, the racialization of a position, the underpaid, underqualified, but also what I call the economy of exhaustion. That the fact that these women are constantly exhausted. You see them, in Paris, you see them in the subway, if you take the subway early in the morning, they arrive, they sit, they sleep right away, like in 2 seconds, right? Because in fact, they live very far, and they have to take the transportation for 1 hour, 1 hour and a half. Some of them, when I talk to them, they wake up at 4 a.m. in the morning to be at work at 7. And then they have to do 2, 3 places, because one is not enough for getting a decent wage. And transportation is not, taken into account in their salary. And then they go home, they have to take care of the kids and cook the food for the men. Okay, so this economy, it's being told by women who work in Maputo, in Johannesburg, in Mexico City, in Chicago, Paris, or Berlin, it's the same thing. And it's an economy that is really connected with neoliberalism, and that contrasts with the body, the performing body of the young banker, manturer, who work 12 hours a day, has no Sunday, no Saturday, because he's he's run around, and that is presented as absolutely the body of today, right? The able body, the guy who can, or the woman, in fact, for that matter, the corporate body, which can effectively sleep very little, but is associated with success, and is rewarded, and is white, and is heteronormal, heterosexual and things like that, compared to the body of the racialized woman who is exhausted, underqualified, underpaid, and totally, and is victim of racism. That's one thing for me, and also that it creates a new division between cleanliness and dirtiness. This place in the city which have to be clean, so the middle class can go around, and green spaces for the kids, and so the kids can breathe, good air. And, all this place like becoming the gentrification, is associated with cleanliness, has to be. And the place where these people live, the garbage will be not picked up, the air can be polluted, the water can be polluted, right? This is really the difference also being constructed. And for me, this is a feminist struggle. So I start with that, and so I became interested a lot, this question of cleaning, and the fact, of course, we know what black feminists have said, that white women of the middle class could enter the job market because the babies, the kids had a nanny and also a cook. But I'm talking also not just the private space, I'm talking about the public space. I'm interested in the public space. It's a growing industry everywhere in the world because there is a huge demand. Because neoliberalism needs offices, more offices, and more commercial mall, bigger and bigger. And the airport have to be museum, plus commercial mall, plus airport. Nonetheless, you don't nonetheless have to take a plane. And the same thing, for a railway station. So really, the cleanliness of this space in which neoliberalism has to provide for the circulation of work and wealth has to be clean, right? Have to be clean. And you have to make the cleaning totally invisible. So this is why I think these strikes are very important, because they absolutely put in the open exactly what is one of the foundation of that system. So it's not just asking for salary. Like all the work which was done in Italy and elsewhere on domestic work. Of course, women are exploited and doing the double, even the triple day. But I'm talking about this new industry, the growing industry, which is targeting absolutely women of color everywhere in the world. So the racialization can be Filipino woman in Malaysia, or Thai woman in Beirut, and in Beirut you find women from Madagascar and Thailand, how they have arrived in Beirut. So there is this organization, which then, of course, we read it mostly in the newspaper what happened in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. But so that masks what's happening everywhere, right? It's again making an issue, a women's rights issue of abuse by these people, who on top of it are Arabs and Muslims, and mask, what's happening in terms of an organization, a vast organization, a global organization. But this is, decolonial feminism, what I saw in this movement from the global south, but also in Europe, was effectively this critique of what Sarah Faris has called femonationalism, but for me, again, I go even further with this civilizing feminism. And is really challenging the idea that Europe was the natural place for women's rights and understanding of equality between men and women. And I just want to say points and give two examples that I gave in the book. There are the women of the 18th century who are celebrated because they were anti-slavery, right? Like Olympe de Gouges in France and all that. And it's an interesting to read, especially Olympe de Gouges, who is this French playwright and who went to the guillotine. So of course she's a derby, and who wrote the Declaration of Women and the Citizen, which was an answer to the Declaration of Rights of Men and Citizens. And she's absolutely celebrated. And when I dare to say that you can have anti-slavery and being racist, which was the case of some anti-slavery people. They were against slavery, but this was not for that matter, but they considered black people as equal to them, right? Slavery was bad, but that does not mean that black people were equal. And so that you have an anti-slavery and an abolitionist movement, which is racist. The way you can have the left and feminism, which is racist. It's not by nature that this escape, are protected. And the fact that the innocence, I want to suggest that with you, that analysis. I think European feminism focus on male domination, right? Women are victims of men, right? So by then they could say that enslaved women are their sisters, or colonized women are their sisters, right? Because they say, we are the property of our husband and father, the way slaves are the property of their owners, right? So this analogy. and they forget the question of rights. By then, I mean, the feeling that the fact that they were, in fact, the victim, and that patriarchy was the worst things, you know, made them absolutely blind to the way in which race, colonialism had, slavery had, you know, of course, what you call intersectionality, but not just that, had to the question of oppression. And in Europe, a lot of feminists in the 19th century were for colonization. A lot of them, very few were against, very few. I mean, you have some, and they are the owner of, you know, of European feminism, but most of them were for colonization because they thought that in fact in this country where women were oppressed, feminism will liberate women. And so colonization should be feminist. And you do have books in French, and I have found also some articles in English, in which feminists are defending a feminist colonization and saying that feminists will be the best people to colonize because they know what is oppression and they will know how to bring in this colonized society into liberal society and liberal democracy. And one of them, Bertino Claire, went to Algeria, and Algeria was already then a department. She did, I mean, she's a very important French feminist, Republican. And a book, you know, there was a big book she has on Algeria, and she, effectively, there was already all the elements of Islamophobia, you know, like this society cannot understand the equality between women and men, and we will bring that. And she has a whole defense of colonizing feminism in that book, and saying that Muslim women won't just have just one dream, she said, to become like French women. And so, and she has another an entire book on the vote of women that was published in 1904, in which she, I mean, each chapter is about defending the woman's right to vote, women's suffrage, saying, you know, for instance, some people say, oh, if they vote, they're going to follow the priest because they are constantly in church. And she said no, and so on. So each chapter answered to, you know, the different counter-argument. And one chapter is about black men. Because 1848 gave the right to vote to the free slave in the French colony, right? I mean, they were not really allowed to exercise that right, but in the law, they had that right. And she had this book, she has this huge article in which she protests, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others will protest also in the United States, against the fact that you give the vote, the right to vote to black men who are not educated, who do not understand what is freedom and equality, and you don't give it, and she wrote like that, to women of the white race who are educated and civilized. And this, so you find, I mean, in many of writing, except for some, as I say, but what I was interested in is like, where does this come from, of European writing, of an absolutely misunderstanding. I mean, so you will have Rosa Luxembourg, but even Rosa Luxembourg, in her writing on imperialism, she will mostly insist on what imperialism does to the working class in Europe, right? That it makes them accomplice, or it will, you know, or it will lower their wages and so on because it will put them in competition. I mean, very few. I mean, we can talk about the different leaders here, but what I mean is like, in fact, for me, it's not to do the trial of this woman. You know, it's how can we still, in 2019, continue to defend that legend about European feminism? How can we still, you know, perpetuate that illusion that Europe was a natural soil of the equality between men and women, and the other country, I mean, the other society did not understand? How Islamophobia was born among people from the left, feminists of the left, and how effective it was a left in France, but also partly in England also, we can say, led the counter-revolution, the ideological counter-revolution in Europe, in terms of effectively saying that anti-colonialism and revolution were in fact bad projects, projects which really brought in fact quite. So it's what I'm meaning, what I meant by that is that, again, you know, it's not that this group did that and that group criticized. It's why women's rights have become so hegemonic and so much a support of neoliberalism and imperialism, which was not the case. How women's rights have become really the most important card in their hand because as I say, it's very difficult to be against women's rights. So it's much more interesting than even, in terms of ideology, like that effectively hegemony of this ideology than even technology or other things, and you can see how women's rights really trigger a lot of emotion in a different campaign. Perhaps not here, but I can tell you in England or Spain. And so decolonial feminism is that movement that really challenges all this, and that we see through the women's strike throughout the world, or the fact also that women who demonstrate in Buenos Aires are connecting the attack against feminicide with indigenous people's right to land, with criticism of neoliberalism and criticism of imperialism in South America. So this, this is really finally, and this was there in the 70s, but it was recovered by the feminism of the North through that UN decade, through different things, and is really now coming back, and I think that is very, and we also see in Europe. So there is something now that where feminism is that feminism of the South, when I say the South, also in the North, is bringing back a political feminism that is necessarily anti-racist, anti-capitalist, and anti-imperialist. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Françoise. I think we can open the floor because we have half an hour to 20 minutes, half an hour for questions and answers. So if there's any question, I can come with the microphone. Yes.
Because I nowadays see here in Netherlands and in countries all over the world actually that feminism is still sort of used as a tool to oppress women of color in particular. So we have right-wing parties speaking about harassment only when refugees are the perpetrators, or they only speak about oppression when they want to get rid of the hijab and all of that. And for example, also with LGBTQI rights, they speak about oppressing those group of people while they don't acknowledge the fact that they've put in those anti-LGBTQ laws in former colonies. So I think it's becoming a little bit of, not a little bit, very hypocritical of these people speaking about sort of women's rights when all they try to do is penalize women of color by doing that. So I was just wondering how you feel about that. And, yeah.
Shall we collect a
Yes,
couple
right.
more questions and then it will be.
So, thank you very much for your lecture. And I have different questions, but I want to start with a question that maybe is also linked to this. So I was very fascinated by the trajectory you traced from the 70s to the early 90s, from women's liberation and feminism to women's rights to human rights. And you ended with Beijing Conference on Women 1995 and the discourse by Hillary Clinton. So it's a kind of, this is the kind of trajectory of how women's rights as human rights become allied with neoliberalism, the way you presented it, right? But I think in the past few years, we also see another version or another alliance between neoliberalism and a very clear attack on women's rights. We see, so we don't have only Clintons or Blair and so on and so forth, but we also have Trump, we have Bolsonaro, we have Orban, we have Salvini in Italy, and so on and so forth. And I don't think that's a different story, but I think there are some contradictions there, because when you ask who can be against women's rights, I think these people are very clearly anti-woman, anti-feminist, for sure anti-abortion. So how do you incorporate this, someone call it backlash, I don't know, how do you conceptualize precisely this moment, right? And its relation to that kind of neoliberal version of women's rights.
Thank you. One more maybe? There.
I think one writer I'm thinking of is Valerie Hudson, who kind of came up with a gender-based peace theory. And these feminists usually work in a quantitative research setting that are able to